let's try a little bit more of mental gymnastics.
Oh no. You like my, that's your copyright.
I know.
Yeah, I'm a copyright.
Yes. Now, we've already seen something of the problem, and the problem is this. No Jew can accept any plurality in God. God is God. God is indivisible. God is one, etc. God is unique, etc. Therefore, it would have been unthinkable to that early Christian community with its Jewish heritage to come out with a saying like, we've now got two gods. Therefore, how are we going to talk about the one God, but also to make sense of the three things that we've seen repeatedly during the day? Firstly, the life, ministry, teaching of Jesus. Secondly, the resurrection and post-resurrection appearances that, as it were, throw the whole ball in the air. And thirdly, the complete bursting out of the early Christian community after, on the day of Pentecost and after. So how are we going to talk about it? Well, if you were a Jew in this situation, where would you go for help? You'd be bound to go to the only thing you know, which is to the Old Testament, to the Scriptures. And if you go back into the Scriptures, you will find, now remember, we're talking from now on pre-Jesus. This is the Old Testament. You go back into the Old Testament and you will find that the Old Testament speaks about God as Father. This cannot mean that God has kids. Far exalted is God above having children. This cannot mean that God is a man. Far exalted is God above having a sexual nature. So what does it mean? Well, first of all, it says that God is totally transcendent. God exercises no sexuality. Therefore, this is figurative language, which gives us a glimpse and insight into what God is like. It is not a literal description. In order to prove this, as it were, the Old Testament also uses feminine names of God. So just as you're using masculine names of God, you're also using feminine names and images. For example, in the book of Isaiah, for a long time I have held my peace. I have kept still and restrained myself, and now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. This is God speaking through Isaiah. God is compared to a midwife in the book of Psalms. God is compared to a nursing mother. God is compared to a comforting mother. And so we see that both male and female images are used of God. So it's dogged Christian theology all the way down through the centuries, this use of male imagery and male language, which in the mind of people gives a kind of masculinity to God. But that is not what is meant. Far exalted is God above gender, above sex, above having children, etc. If you're going to have children, it takes two of you, and it takes two of the same sort. You know, you can't have a human man and a dog producing children, for example. You've got to be two of the sort. And by definition, God is unique. There's only one of God. Therefore, God is unpartnered. God is God. So to call God Father does not imply any of that. It's figurative speech. It's figurative speech. it goes on in various books in the Old Testament to use language of God as God is king, also sometimes God husband or lover. The most common one, which is repeated over and over again, about 20 times in total, is to speak of God as Father. Father of the orphans and protector of the widows. So you can see the kind of imagery that's being used. So, they say, let's go for help to the scriptures and let's speak of God in terms of Father. That's one block on the page, as it were. That which is incarnated is not God the Father. That which remains, that which is eternally transcendent, is what we can now begin to call God as Father. Now, then they go and search in the scriptures and say, what term is used for those special individuals who are in a special relationship with God? And the Hebrew scriptures use the term Son of God. They cannot be talking biology. We've already seen far exalted is God above having children. When they use the term Son of God, of whom do they use it? Well, the Old Testament uses the term Son of God of 4 different groups of people. First, it is used of the whole Hebrew nation when they are obedient to God, when they live according to God's direction. So this term, Son of God, implies obedience and living according to the command. Secondly, it's used of the angels. Angels are called. In the Hebrew scriptures, they're called sons of God. What's their function? Messengers. So part of this term, Son of God, implies messengership. Thirdly, it's used of kings of Israel. All of them? No, not all of them. Only some of them. Well, what are the characteristics of those of whom it is used? And those characteristics are, they represent the people before God, and they represent God before the people. Secondly, they rule according to the will, the revelation, the law of God. So you're not an arbitrary ruler, you are the servant of God ruling as the king of the people. We get phrases like, today I have begotten you. Now, this does not mean this is the day of my birth. It's the day of my enthronement as the king. So one becomes king. One is adopted then as Son of God. And this starts from the time that you become king and standing in this particular relationship. One of the natures of this covenant that we saw earlier, you remember the covenant with Noah and the rainbow, the covenant with Abraham and so on. God is always faithful to the covenant, whatever you do, even if you break it. And if you go back and you look at the covenant with Abraham, you will notice, if you read in the Hebrew scriptures, that Abraham is told to take various animals, split them in two, lay them side by side. This is a typical way of making a sacrifice, if you see what I mean. You lay the two halves side by side like that, and then God, and only God, in the form of a pillar of fire, passes between them. God commits himself, herself, to that covenant unbreakably. So this is part of this nature of kingship as well. Finally, the fourth group, who are called sons of God, are what are called the righteous Israelites, those whose life is so filled with godliness, with obedience to the way of God, that they, as it were, manifest. They manifest God in the way in which they work. So I have a quotation here. Be like a father to the orphans, be like a husband to their mother. You will then be a son of the Most High, and he will love you more than does your mother. So through their actions, they manifest this love of God. Now, all these four categories are called sons of God in the Hebrew Scriptures, before Jesus is ever thought of. Now, what we then have in this term, is a job description and not a biological description. And in this job description, the Son of God is one who is perfectly obedient to the Father, one who represents God to the people to God, one whose life is so filled with godliness that they make God manifest in the midst of the people, one who in a sense stands between God and the people, one who lives in total dependence upon the Father. Now, in the biblical tradition, sons have no power of their own. Everything they have is dependent upon their father. So everything that the Son has is gift from the Father. Secondly, sons, according to Jewish law, have a unique privilege that sons can sign on behalf of their father when no other agent can. When the solicitor can't do it, when the organizer of the labor force can't do it, whatever it is, only the son can sign on behalf of the father. So you can uniquely commit the father into something. Sonship is not by birth, it is by election or adoption. It is not by procreation. Now, election here doesn't mean who gets the majority. Election means I choose you. Okay? And finally, the Son is the instrument of God's will. Now, all this then is coming from the Hebrew Scriptures. So when they come to use the title Son of God of Jesus, this is the content of the name. But then what they do is that they, as it were, they capitalize it. So there were lots of sons of God in the past, and now there's one capital S, capital G, as it were. So they still want to maintain a uniqueness in Jesus, but it is uniqueness of a title that has a pedigree and a history. That gives us some language for talking about Jesus in relationship to the Father. So a father-son discourse, as it were. Now, we then have to talk about what sense do you make of the power of God released on the day of Pentecost? Because this power not only has a profound impact at that time, but it's the same power which is at work in all human beings in varying degrees all the time. Therefore, they want to think about what are the characteristics of this power. Now, if you imagine that you are a nomadic people wandering around the desert, what is the most powerful thing you ever come across, which is totally invisible, which is totally uncontrollable, which is so powerful that it changes the landscape around you, which cannot possibly be denied, which cannot be controlled, you don't know where it's coming from and where it's going to, and all you can do when it hits you is to lay down on the floor, cover your head and hope to live through it. That's the desert wind. Now, in Hebrew, as in Arabic, the same word, ruach, ru, is used for wind, is used for breath, and is used for spirit. So therefore, this is called the Ruach Yahweh, the Spirit of God, the wind of God, the breath of God. Now, this is the breath of God that is breathed into Adam when life is given to him. It is the wind of God, as it were, that you cannot control, that strikes where it will, that's so powerful it changes the world around you, but is totally undeniable. You get caught in the desert wind and say, well, it's not really windy today. You wouldn't do that for many seconds. And at the same time, then, it is this power, this Spirit of God. So that's how they come to refer to it. Now, again, all that is coming from the Hebrew Scriptures. So this desert wind, the most unpredictable, invisible, powerful, uncontrollable, irresistible, undeniable thing, this Spirit of God, this wind of God, this breath of God. So now you've got three forms of speech to talk about your experience of God's action at work in your life, in, as it were, the Jesus story. That's as far as you can get if you are stuck in the Hebrew biblical context. Because Hebrew is not a philosophical language. The whole biblical thing is a story language, an image language. It's not a philosophical language. The next stage has to come when you start to find Greek-speaking, philosophically trained people becoming Christians. And they, as you can imagine, start to ask the why questions, the how questions. How can it possibly be? Because that's what they're trained to do. Now, they then start to develop a whole code of speech to try to talk about the relationship of these three elements within the oneness of God. And they do that by using various Greek terms. So the first term they use is ousia. And ousia we can translate as substance. There is one of you. There is one substance. There are not many of you. Therefore, there is one God, one ousia. This one God cannot be divided. There is only one ousia. And now the problem comes when you start to get into talk of threeness. Because the first thing they do is to use the word prosopon. And prosopon is, in Greek, it means a mask. Now it's the mask which is used in Greek theatre. So in Greek theatre, you do not have costumes. You have a mask that you hold in front of your face. And the actor speaks through the mask. And the mask then gives you your character. Now, if you're a bit short of actors, you can have another mask behind your back, and you can have a character change. So you can have 2 prosopon, and only 1 actor, 1 ousia. And if you're really short of actors, you can have 3. And so, okay, so this is the first way they find to speak about it. Now, here's the problem. No matter how good an actor you are, you can only play one part at a time. Yeah? So you're constantly switching them round. And therefore they said that's no good. As a model, as a way of speech, that doesn't work. Because we need you to be all 3 at once. So drop it. But before they dropped it, the Blighters translated it into Latin, personae. Remember the old Shakespeare plays, dramatis personae, who are the players in the play? And of course, once you translate that into English, you get person, which is where we get this very misleading language of 3 persons in one God. Because that's like saying 1, 2, 3, 3 separate persons, one God. Totally unacceptable for Christian theology. There is only one. So let's ditch the word personae. Let's ditch the mask. Let's ditch any talk about persons, prosopons. And so then the theologians came up with another term, and that was hypostasis. What is hypostasis? It's a mode of being. What's a mode of being? Let me give you 2 examples that perhaps help to make it a little clearer. We have before us today 1 adult woman. How many women are there? 1. How many ousia are there? 1. But this 1 woman has 3 different modes of being. 1 is her daughter mode. She is the daughter of her father. The 2nd is her wife mode. She is the wife of her husband. And the 3rd is her mother mode. She is the mother of her children. 1 woman, 3 different modes of being. And you can see that being daughter, wife, and mother are very different modes of being. But you have all 3 at the same time. Therefore, they said, 1 ousia, 3 hypostases. You've all 3 at the same time. And they are not confused. You do not interact with your father the way that you interact with your husband, let's say. But there is a degree of internal dialogue going on. You know, there must have been an awful lot of women over the centuries who've said, how do I deal with this wretched husband? Well, how did my mother deal with my father? So you have a kind of internal dialogue is going on. You know, how do I deal with this child? How did my parents deal with me? So you have a kind of internal dialogue, because you've got to maintain oneness, but also flow, fluidity, movement. Because one of the things then that Christianity wants to say is that it is of the very nature of God to be loving. Now, it is not that God loves something outside of God, because God existed before there was anything outside of God. Yeah? God is the creator of everything that exists other than God. Therefore, what we term the fellowship of the Trinity is an internal loving activity, constantly loving the other hypostases. So you're constantly pouring out love upon the other. So you've got this constant idea of flow and motion. Right. Leave your mothers and your wives out of it for a moment. Let's take another model. Now, we're all aware that that is a liquid called water. So that is a glass of water. There is one substance there. If I was to freeze that, it would turn into a solid. So it would have another mode of being, another hypostasis. It would now be ice. But it's the same volume of water, the same substance. And you know that if I was to heat that, it would give off water vapor. And when that water vapor started to condense, we'd see steam. But it's the same volume of water. It's the same substance that now has another hypostasis. So these two, two at a time, we're very familiar with. You see the kettle, cooking and so on. Now, if you go along and ask a scientist, if you subject that glass of water to exactly the right temperature and exactly the right pressure, you can actually get solid ice, liquid water, and gaseous steam, gaseous vapor, all at the same time. Now, it's absolutely there. The physicists will tell you, but it's very hard even to imagine. It's very hard even to believe it might be true, but it's what the physicists will tell us, that if you get the right combination of temperature and pressure, you can have all three forms of this liquid at the same time. Doesn't matter what the liquid is. So liquid, solid and gas existing all at the same time, three hypostases, one substance. In a sense, they can be separate, but in a sense, the substance is there fully, completely, all the time. So you can never say that one part of God is doing one thing and another part of God is doing another thing, because God cannot have parts, cannot be divided up. So the whole of God is acting in the mode of Father. The whole of God is acting in the mode of Son. The whole of God is acting in the mode of Spirit. That's why, to go back to an earlier point, we had to say the fullness of divinity is in Jesus, not a bit of it. Because you can't have parts. And yet, the three forms, the three modes of being, are clearly distinguishable. Now that's the kind of mental gymnastics that Christian philosophers have used to try to talk about this interaction with which they try to explain God. Or to talk about God rather than to explain, because you can't explain God. By its very nature, God is beyond all our human capacity to talk about, to know, etc. God is ineffable.
God is drinkable.
And sniffable. And suckable, as it were.
He is the
You need a poet. Poetry.
I need poetry.
Yes.
I don't have any poetry. I'm a philosopher, not a poet, I'm afraid. The trouble is that poetry will get you into figurative language. And as long as you understand that it is figurative language, okay. The great difficulty is that lots of people, lots of Christians, talk about the three persons of the Trinity like one of those wedding lineups. You know, you go along to the wedding reception, you have to shake hands. How do you do? How do you do? How do you do? As though there were three hands there to be shaken, three persons of the Trinity. Nonsense. Because what you're doing is completely against the whole thing. And the whole thing exists in order to protect the absolute oneness and indivisibility of God. Because as soon as you start dividing God up, you're in dead trouble. Can't do that.
What's the difference between God and Godhead?
Godhead is a kind of relational term, so that we can say that, the three hypostases exist in the Godhead. It's a kind of relational thing. One of the images that's sometimes used is that it's this idea of flow and movement, you see. It's not only, if you ask me to give you a kind of philosophical definition of God, I would say God is that unique source and flow of life and love. Unique source and flow, movement, of life and love.
Not be light.
You can have light if you want. But it's that notion of movement, you see. Now, because you can have movement, and because you're not limited here, you're not into numbers games, you see. When Christians talk about coming into the fullness of what it is to be human, and they say that is becoming like Christ, another Christ, I am then entering into my true human nature, which is to be both human and divine, and I am then coming into this fellowship of the oneness of God, but as it were through the hypostasis, through this doorway, through the doorway of Jesus. You need a microphone.
Who do you pray to?
You need a microphone.
So can I ask, when you pray, who
Yes?
do you pray to?
I pray to God.
God the Father?
God, God, God. Because these are totally inseparable. So if I say I worship God, and then somebody says, oh, they're worshipping Jesus, this is not capable of being separate. Because the wholeness of divinity is present in all the elements of the Trinity. Therefore, one worships God.
But Christians do pray to Jesus.
Oh yes, some people would talk to Jesus because, as it were, they kind of...
Wouldn't God the Father become jealous?
Oh no, because they feel that, the human face of God, as you might say, is somehow more accessible to me than, something less so.
Intercession.
Well, it's like intercession, if you like. But actually, if you ask a theologian what's going on there, she would say, all prayer is addressed to God in the person of Jesus. So when I say in the name of Jesus, I am saying I identify myself with Jesus. So it's not an external through which I go, it's an identity that I take on by the power of the Spirit who lives in me. So all prayer is necessarily Trinitarian. Please.
That's what I was going to say. Well, you put it better than me. But no, that's how I've been brought up to pray. But it is, I find it, I understand what you're saying, and it's always a difficult thing. But Jesus did pray to the Father. He taught us how to pray, our Father.
Yeah.
And he prayed, according to John, in the Garden of Gethsemane. We don't know if those were really his words, but yeah. I'm just trying to get my head around it.
But
I believe it, but
the earthly Jesus has no option,
yeah,
you know, because
he's human.
of his humanity, the same as the rest of us. Otherwise, he's playing at it. You see, if Jesus is there saying, go on, kill me if you want, don't worry, lads, I'll show you, just 3 days, I'll be out the box. It's a joke. Human suffering is not real, not taken on. It's a joke. So actually, he goes fully through, as it were, the agony of human suffering, in the hope, like the rest of us, that God will somehow vindicate him. But if, as it were, he knows the outcome, I know I've won the game, well, you know, that's not like the rest of us, is it? So that's not, I mean, that's play acting and not being fully human. So Jesus is also, because he's fully in his humanity, is living with the same tension. Now, we might say, I am a person of deep and wonderful faith. I do not fear death. I trust that God will be there and will welcome me into the next life. That may be so. Alhamdulillah, if that's the case. But for most of us, there's an element of fear and trembling in this. That's how it is with Jesus too. An element of fear and trembling, but of full and total conviction, as it were, trust in God. God will somehow put this right. I am being unjustly punished here. So God will vindicate me.
So what about the most common prayer, Our Father?
Yeah?
Are you referring to Father as God? Is it synonymous?
You cannot separate them. That's the whole point. So if you're speaking of God as Father, you're speaking of the wholeness of God. But in our human context, we need this kind of imagery to try to make sense of this, as it were, the different modes, the different hypostases, but the oneness of God. And so therefore, Jesus, as a human being, teaching other human beings to pray, speaks of God in this human, relational, intimate term.
But Jesus is never mentioned in Our Father.
No.
It's a universal prayer. Anyone can say it.
That's right, because he is praying as a human being before God. So any human being can pray that prayer. And certainly, I mean, I've been in meetings of many different nationalities, Muslims and Christians. I remember one very big Muslim Shia scholar standing beside me who was a native Arabic speaker. And when we were asked to pray the Lord's Prayer in our own language, he had no problem in praying the Lord's Prayer in Arabic. Because he knew what he was saying, as it were. He knew he wasn't talking to something other than the one and only indivisible God. Even though the language might have sounded a bit like it. Yes, sir.
I think my question is similar to what sorry?
Eileen.
What Eileen asked in a way. So I'm just, because when I read the Bible, it seems to me that Jesus is saying, he never says worship me. He always says worship the Father before it's too late, when no mountain or no, synagogue in Jerusalem matters. Worship in trueness and in spirit to the Father. And then there was another reference of him bowing and on the it's like putting his forehead on the floor and worshiping and praying. Because I'm just trying to get my head around the idea that if Jesus is God, then, or part of that Trinity, then why would he be praying to another higher being or to the Father if he is the part of the God itself? I just wonder if I just wonder to what your opinion is with regards to that. And
I would distinguish between being something and knowing that I am that something. So it is part of the growing consciousness of Jesus, of his growing to understand exactly who and what he is. It is part of our humanity to see ourselves as human beings as other than God. So therefore, in his humanity as the Palestinian Jesus, he is praying to God as any other Palestinian man of his time. And he is gradually growing in consciousness of who and what he is. I would say, my own opinion is that he doesn't fully enter into the consciousness of who and what he is until after his death, after his resurrection, when in fact he ascends into heaven. And then he enters fully into an awareness of who and what he is. So it's a question of consciousness, not what you are, that's static. But consciousness is an ever-expanding thing. And it's part of this thing about vindication as well, you see. I trust, well, there's no point in trusting if you know. You know? If you've got the £10 note in your hand, there's no point in telling me that I trust I've got £10 in my hand. You know. But if I say to you, I trust that there's £10 if I get the questions right in the exam, then there's an element there of actual trust.
So this leads to my second
Yep.
question, if I may. So when I also, again, read the Bible, you know, the different Gospels, there's nowhere in the Gospels that mention that Jesus claims to be God apart from the Gospel of John. So, I mean, if Jesus is God, and that's a major thing, you know, in Christianity, it has to be clear-cut all throughout the four Gospels. Yeah. And if it's not, I wonder, like, to what extent is this true, and why is it that in the Gospel of John it says it, but not in all other Gospels?
Yeah. Remember, first of all, that the Gospel of John is being written at the very last, at the end of the first century, some 70 years after the death of Jesus. So by this stage, you've got a certain amount of growing awareness in the early Christian community of who and what Jesus is. Secondly, it's written in a very deeply theological language. It's not telling stories about Jesus like the other Gospels are. So it's a question of progression there. If Jesus had stood up and said, listen, lads, in case you hadn't noticed, I'm God, it would have removed from the human being that growth in depth of faith. So the only element of faith would be whether or not you believe the statement of Jesus, instead of growing ever deeper into an awareness of exactly what God has done. So I would say that my faith is now much deeper, clearer, more secure, more clearly identified than it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Because I am bringing the whole of my life experience to bear on that, and that is a human activity. You know, when we embark on any relationship or any human endeavor, you don't know the full story right at the beginning. If you knew exactly what was going to happen in every year of your married life, you'd never get married, as it were. So that you're constantly unpacking and revealing and extending this thing, and therefore constantly committing to the next step. It's part of a human dynamic. But you're perfectly right. I do not think that at any stage Jesus stands up and says to the lads, listen, in case you haven't caught on, this is what I am. Nor do I think that we can say that the disciples worshipped Jesus. I do not think that's true.
A comment on each of your questions.
Sorry, is that on?
There is
No,
a
no,
light.
turn the light off.
Turn it off. How do I do that?
But just press, yes,
Press the light. How's that?
Oh, yes.
I hope it's worth it now. Yeah, Jesus never claimed to be God, but when others said it to him, when the time was right, when he once asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And he got 3 answers, the last one being from Peter, saying, "You are the Christ." Did he say the Son of God? I might not have it quite
You
right.
are the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Son of the living God. Jesus didn't deny it, but the time was not right for everybody to know, because that would have been the end of his ministry.
The son is different.
Okay, so he didn't deny it, and then during his trial before the crucifixion, when he was being asked who he was, when again I probably won't have the words right, but it was said, well, no, they say you're the Son of God. Is that true?
Sorry, the Son of God could, in the Gospel, in Romans, Son of God could refer to anyone following the Spirit of God is considered the Son of God.
Well, this is what he was on trial for. And at that point he could have said, no, and then escaped. But he didn't. He said, well, you say I am, but he wouldn't deny it. And then the earlier question about praying, there are only a couple of examples in the Gospels of when of his actual prayers, but it does often say Jesus got up early in the morning, went out to pray, and we've no idea what the content of those prayers were. So we couldn't comment on who he was addressing, what title he gave them, or what the form, because a lot of Christians believe that praying isn't necessarily just worship. It can be communicating, which isn't necessarily a bowing down and worshipping.
It's not just the praying. Like, I think when they ask him about the day of the judgment.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Oh.
It's not just about the praying, from my understanding. When they ask Jesus about the day of the judgment, he says, "I don't know when that is. No one knows, not even the angels in the heaven, but the Father."
Yeah.
And also there's a reference, another one saying, he says, "I am nothing without the Father." So if he is God, then why is he nothing without the Father? Or why does he not know of the hour? Because if he is God, he should know when the day of judgment is. Do you see what I mean?
Well, you say he should know.
Sorry.
You say he should know, but why should he know? Because you see, it is of the nature of humanity. It is of the nature of being a human being to live in a kind of suspense and hope and trust and so on. If you know, I mean, it's like the question, would you like to know the hour of your own death? Now, most people would say, not entirely sure about that, because there's that degree of embracing the uncertainty. So if Jesus had had full and certain knowledge of all these things, that would have lifted him out of our common humanity.
Why could he not have said, for example, "Oh, like, I cannot say it, you cannot bear it," or as opposed to saying, no one knows, not even the angels in the heavens, but the Father? Because in a way, he's sort of separating his entity from God, or the higher power. Do you know what I mean? If they're inseparable.
It's not about a higher power, but it is about, I am fully incarnate into my human form. And if in this human form I am holding something back from you, then I'm treating you wrongly. I'm telling you all I know. I'm telling you all I am. Otherwise, it's a bit like kind of magician. And Jesus is not a magician. It's the entering into the fullness. So he doesn't know during his earthly life. God knows. I don't know. When's the end of the world going to come? Don't know. That, I think, is just a simple statement of fact.
So is it that in terms of this level of superiority, that the Father in the heaven is higher than the Son on earth?
No. You can never have highers and lowers in this system. You have, not only do you have fully equal partnership, as it were, or fully equal fellowship, but you also have, you cannot separate God out. So you, when I say God lives in me, this doesn't mean part of God, it doesn't mean the Spirit of God, it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean Jesus lives in me, it means the whole of the divinity, because you can't be separating it out. So you've not got superiority, but you have got an understanding that I in Jesus in his human life is, in a sense, physically separate from the divine Trinity, the divine entity. Physically separate, physically identifiable might be better, because again, we always get ourselves in a complete twist with this language, as though there was some place where God is. And of the very nature of God, God is not limited by time, and God is not limited by space. So there is nowhere that God is, and there is nowhere that God is not, because God is not limited by space. So we often talk about, well, God up there or something. Well, that's our poetic language. But the reality is there are no limits on God. God is not limited by space. God is not limited by time. So yesterday, today, and tomorrow are all now with God, because God's not limited by time. And, earth, sky, earth, water, me, you are all irrelevant in terms of God, because God is not limited by space.
So is he omnipresent?
Yes, absolutely. She is.
Just, a comment really. It seems like this whole process towards Jesus becoming divine. Matthew, Mark, Luke did not mention this, but then John did, after 70 years or so. And then after 300 years, you have this Greek ideas of ousia and hypostasis.
Yeah.
It just comes to mind that, the Muslim prayer, the Fatiha,
Yeah.
it talks about those who have gone astray.
Yeah.
The Dalin.
Yeah.
Okay. And this seems to me like it's crying out, like, these are the ones who got astray,
You wouldn't be the first Muslim commentator to say that. That is, of course, a classic.
Every single Muslim our father, Fatiha, talks about those who got astray.
That's right. That's right. And, so there is a whole stream of Muslim tafsir on that surah, which talks about, identifies the Jews with those who have incurred God's anger, incurred God's wrath, and the Christians of those who've gone astray.
These are well-meaning people who are striving with the truth.
Yep.
But sadly, they've just gone down this strange alleyway.
Yeah.
That's my...
Well, that's absolutely right. And you can see that you've good Muslim pedigree for accepting that. You wouldn't expect me to agree, of course.
Just a comment.
Can I just say,
Oh,
I'm not
come
sure who said this, but just, I know we're nearly finished. I think, for me, one of the proofs, a major proof of the Christian faith, and why I'm a Christian, is because it's a relationship. And so, you might say the same, and I don't, disagree with that, but because I know in my heart, and I pray, and it all makes sense, but I can see, objectively, I can see why people say, what? That's crazy. But it does make sense when you believe it in your heart.
I don't get it.
But I think that sense of wanting to have that connection is well recognized in Islam. We call it fitra, which is an innate need to worship God.
Yep.
And so it's well understood, and we all share that.
It's just that I think the father-son thing complicates it.
Is it?
It's like a,
Yeah. Is it the language? The language is difficult, isn't it? But you see, if you didn't use human language, then you'd be into what we call I-it relationships instead of I-thou relationships.
Could you explain that?
Well, an I-it relationship is my relationship with that glass. I love it to bits because it gives me the water I need to drink. But my love for it is pretty limited because it's a glass. An I-thou relationship is my relationship with another human being. Now that's of a totally different nature, because this is an interpersonal relationship between two people who can relate with each other, two beings. I can have an I-thou relationship with my dog, because my dog has such a close affinity with me that it's no longer an it, but it's a thou. Now, in the same way, Christian talk of God is very much I-thou relationship. And that's the burden of the language. But I certainly do not think of God as masculine just because I might recite the Our Father. God is not masculine. Doesn't have a gender. God is above all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, the word Father gives me a sense of intimacy in relationship. It's an I-thou relationship, which I wouldn't get if I said, O ye creator of the universe. I mean, that might be one element of it, but it doesn't have the richness of that interpersonal relationship.
So the disciple of Prophet Jesus in his own time, did they talk to him, I, thou, you, Jesus, as of when they were starting to point of worshiping? Did they do that? Did they literally worship him? What was it at that time? Do you think, elaborate on that? What was it in fact when he was over there prostrating, praying, and all his disciples were literally talking to him to worship him, or did they thou him? How was it at that time?
I think the general consensus amongst Christian scripture scholars is that the early disciples who hung around with Jesus did not worship him. They worshipped God.
Okay, thank you.
And when they ask him, teach us how to pray, he brings them into that sort of intimate relationship that he has through calling God Father, as opposed to, O ye creator of all things, as it were. Yes.
Do you say Father?
Yeah. Because the problem about father is, you see, you don't get to be a father until you've got a child. Yeah? And that's where the rub comes. You know, far exalted is God above having children. So that's where the language is so problematic.
Yeah, we have got Rabbana. We have got so
yes.
much. When we do this application, we speak of Rabbana.
Yes, Rab is Lord, Master, you know, the object of my devotion.
Why are the Catholic priests called Father instead?
I think it's an honorific. It's a bit like Sheikh. You know, I know quite a few ulama that you wouldn't necessarily hang the label Sheikh around them, but that's what they're called because it's an honorific. You know? Just as you might call me grey old man, as it were. Please do.
Can I really ask a cheeky question?
Anything. Cheeky, be cheeky.
When I went to America, okay, there's a lady who was a priest, quite shocked because she's practicing the Christianity and the Islam. She's regularly there, praying 5 times a day. It's in all YouTube, you can see it, but I approached her through that. She said, literally, Jesus came to me, said, you've got to become a Muslim. And she had to drop everything. Okay, would you believe me ever that I saw Jesus praying as a Muslim? Would you ever believe me? Or if Jesus appeared to you, say, this is the way. Well, I mean, just imagine.
Yeah.
What would you say to him, or what would you do? Would you just drop whole rest of your life? I mean, sorry, you're not like a ladies to cover up your age. I'm 61, so I don't mind. How old are you? Like 70? 70 years on the earth. Yes. You live this life, and suddenly Jesus came and said, oops, you were wrong, just this way. What would you do? Do you have that capacity, that strength, or that bravery to drop this, say yes? Or you do not? You don't need to answer it. But it's just out of curiosity, because I went through this with many people. Why did you become Muslim? He says, I had no choice. They're not asking anyone else to do, but it was some type of personal experience that they had to bow into it.
Yeah.
Would you consider those stories like it's true, or how would you react to it?
I would certainly consider that was a real possibility, because it is not for me to dictate to God how God acts. And if God chooses to call me to become a Zoroastrian, I can't, but I could become a Sikh or a Muslim or whatever, if I truly believe that that is God's call to me, then as an obedient servant of God, I must respond to it. When I'm asked, after all this study of Islam, why haven't you become a Muslim? One of the answers I give to that question is because I believe that God called me to follow in the way of Jesus, and until such time as I believe that God calls me to some other way, I shall continue on this path. But it's all about response, you see. If somebody comes to me and says, I used to be a Christian, now I'm a Muslim, what do you think about that? I say, on the day of judgment, you'll have to answer for your life before God. There'll be nowhere to hide. If you're telling me, knowing that, you believe that God has called you to be a Muslim, what can I say except Alhamdulillah? It's not for me to tell God what God should do. That's part of being a creature and not the creator. And if God should so call me, I hope that I would have the honesty and integrity to respond in that way.
Bless you.
So, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I've got a question, but I just want to add something to what was just said. No, I mean, by definition, what is a Muslim? A Muslim is one who lives in submission to the God's will. And as far as I can see, you are a Muslim to me. You live a good life, and that's what is important. And you perform your duty as well as you can. And I have a lot of other Christian friends. They are more Muslim than I am. So for me, that's what Islam is about.
Sorry, Quran speaks exactly like you. In Surah Al-Baqarah, number 61, it says the one who believes, the Christian and the Jew.
No, hang on. We have to finish the program at 5:30.
And they start worship.
Last question,
if they do good action on the day of judgment, there is no grief and sorrow for them. This is verse of Quran twice mentioned. So.
Well, the difficulty is, of course, the Quran also says anybody who chooses a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from them. And as you...
That means submission.
No. See, the problem is that, you know, I mean, I hear and I accept what you're saying, and I hear what you're saying too. But we also have to accept that these verses are open to other interpretations and have been interpreted differently down through the centuries. So there are people who've said, for example, that 385 abrogates this verse from Surah Al-Baqarah. And there have been people who've said this is Islam, as it were, with a small I, meaning one who submits to God. And there are others who've said, from the coming of the Quran and Muhammad, there's only one extant path, get on it or take the consequences. So there are different interpretations, you know, and we can't, you know, we shouldn't, I mean, we may have one particular opinion on the question, but we can't ignore that there are others.
Yes, true. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
now your
question is, then from what you described, how did the Nicene Creed come about?
Yeah.
And the doctrine of the Trinity.
Well,
how did that, from where you started, how did it end up with that?
What happens if you read the history of creeds, whether it be in Islam or in Christianity, Creeds start about this long. And then people start to say something, believe something that the community thinks is wrong. So you add into the creed another bit that slaps that one down. And then somebody else comes along and they start to go too far the other way. So you add another bit into the creed until you slap that one down. And you know, you can trace through all those Fiqh Akbar 1s, Fiqh Akbar 2s, Fiqh Hanafiyans, all those different statements of creeds. Now, the same thing is happening in the Christian tradition. The first creed that you have is 3 words: Jesus is Lord. Now, after that, you start to get people, as it were, getting the wrong end of various sticks. And then you have to say, no, no, you've gone too far, son, come back. You've gone too far the other way, come back. So there were those who stress the humanity of Jesus too much and deprive him of his divinity. And there are those who stress the divinity too much and deprive him of his humanity. So you've got all these different trends, and then periodically you have to say, right, clear the table. We're going to use all those earlier bits, but we're going to draw up a new formula which actually states our faith in the best possible way as we can understand it today. That's what happens at Nicaea. So it doesn't fall out of the heavens, and it doesn't come out of a vacuum, but it has a whole process of developing and generating it.
God by committee, isn't it?
It's God by the faithful Christian community that bears faithful witness to what God has done in Christ throughout the years. Just as when Uthman comes to make up the definitive codex of the Quran, he is consulting the people, and the people are saying, well, wait a minute, that bit that he just said, none of the rest of us think that that was, you know, so that bit doesn't get put in. Because...
Well, that's a bit different.
No, it's not a bit different, because it is the divine Spirit of God working in and through the faithful community, guiding them on the right path. Now, it's not the same.
The Trinity is put together through a committee,
No, the Trinity is put together by generations of philosophically trained theologians trying to express their faith, and then they're struggling to say what's the best way of doing it. It is the final decision is taken by the collective Christian community as expressed through its leaders, its bishops and its theologians, who, as it were, say, this is the way, this is it. So it's not something that just, you know, let's have a new creed today. It's not some...
They did have massive disagreements, didn't they? Like,
oh, of course.
He wanted to say that Jesus was a prophet.
Yeah, yeah, you have...
Excommunicated him. And
yeah, yeah. Well, you've got to tidy... you've got to tidy... No, committees suggest majority voting of people with their own agendas. The whole idea is, do you take seriously the Spirit of God guiding the community? And you will know the very important Sunni hadith that says, my community will never agree upon an error. Now, it's the same kind of thing. But it's... whoa.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we can go on till midnight or past that, but at some point we need to bring the program to a close. Thank you so much for Chris. I have no idea how you stand there the whole day and speak the whole time. Thank you so much for giving us your time.